Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to Preservation Connecticut's Spring 2024 series talking about preservation. I'm Stacy Vero. I'm standing in for Jane Montanaro today, who's out of town. But I'm delighted to be your host. And today we're going to welcome Professor Alan Plattus from Yale. He's the founding director of Yale's Urban Design Workshop. And he's going to talk about the work of writer, urbanist, and activist Jane Jacobs, the inspiration for annual walking tours known as Jane's Walk. Jane's Walk is a movement of free citizen-led walking tours. The walks get people to tell their stories about their communities, to explore their cities, and connect with their neighbors. We are going to be sort of co-hosting a series of Jane's Walks with our partner organizations. Preservation Connecticut is bringing Jane's Walk to 14 communities this coming Saturday, next Saturday, May 4th, 2024, which we just learned was Jane's birthday. And for more information about those, you can go to our website, and it's preservationconnecticut.org/Janes-Walk-Connecticut. So we hope you can join us for those. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our organization, if I can advance our slide here. It's not going forward. Go. So who is Preservation Connecticut? For those of you who might not be familiar, I know a number of you are. Let me introduce you to our organization. We're the statewide private nonprofit historic preservation organization founded in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly. We were originally founded as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. We preserve, protect, and promote the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut's communities. And for nearly 50 years, that means our big anniversary is coming up next year, we have successfully advocated for the protection of remarkable community assets all over the state by leveraging funding, building community support, forming partnerships, and promoting stewardship. Our office is located at the National Register listed Eli Whitney Boarding House, built in 1827 on Whitney Avenue in Hamden. It was originally built to house workers for Eli Whitney's gun factory, and it served as Preservation Connecticut's headquarters since 1989. We currently have a staff of 9 preservation professionals and an active board of preservationists from around the state. Staff listed here are always available to assist with inquiries. So Jane, who's our executive director, is currently not with us today, but we have Chris Wiegren with us, who's our deputy director. You can contact Chris with questions about our easement program and to schedule talks or report any Connecticut preservation news. Renee Tribert is our Making Places and Preservation Services manager. You can contact Renee for information on redevelopment of historic industrial sites and tax credit applications. For Jordan Sorensen, who's also with us today, she's our special projects manager, and Jordan manages our communications and outreach to members through social media and email, receives and monitors demolition notices for municipalities, and prepares historic tax credit applications and nominations to the state and national register. Kristen Hopewood is our development manager, and she manages all the inquiries that come through our website, provides member services, arranges special events, and is the editor of our Historic Properties Exchange. And finally, our team of circuit riders, which include Brad Scheid, Mike Farino, Stefan Danchik, and me. We provide in-field services to homeowners, developers, municipal leaders, nonprofit organizations, museums, and historic districts. And you can always contact us for a call or to schedule a site visit. So we started these talks during the pandemic to really continue to serve our audience in a way that was meaningful. And they've continued to be a great way to sort of build community and outreach. So during our talk today, feel free to raise your hand, use the raise your hand feature, but generally we like to save our questions for the end. You can enter them into the chat. And then we can have a nice discussion at the end of the presentation. But with that, I'm going to turn things over to Alan. Thank you so much for joining us today. And
Sure.
We're going to learn more about Jane.
Okay. You need to unshare.
Yeah.
So I can share.
Yep, I've stopped, so you're all set.
Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
A miracle, a modern technology. You would think that with years of COVID and the continuing use of Zoom, we'd all be experts, but it's always an adventure. It's great to be with you all today and to see some old friends and new faces or squares. And what I'm going to do is by no means exhaustive. There's a lot of literature out there by Jane Jacobs and now on Jane Jacobs and her extraordinary career and impact. And if you want in the question period, I'll point you to some things. But Jane is somebody I talk about with my students every year and almost constantly. As a result, I've come to suspect that uh, few of them actually read her book uh, anymore. Maybe they've read a couple of chapters in a course or my course if they actually do the reading. But she's one of those figures that we not only refer to by her first name, but like other hugely important and influential thinkers say, maybe if it's not sacrilege, a figure like Freud. Uh, we think we know what they did and said and argued, but is more or less secondhand now for many people. And I think these things bear revisiting and rereading. I begin with the image or two images that I always use to sort of summarize for my students the real importance and radical nature that Jane Jacobs brought to our field and to other fields. This, of course, is a bit melodramatic in its starkness, but obviously, I'm showing you an image, a highly contrived image, a PR image of New Haven's own Robert Moses, who by the time it was taken was universally recognized not only for his impact, but for his classical, almost Manichaean antagonism for and with Jane Jacobs, who is appearing in a very different kind of image. And that is part of the point I want to make today, that there is a profound shift in attitudes, in language, in discourse, and in culture in general, that these people and these images are part of going on at that time. And obviously, Moses wanted to portray himself as a kind of Olympian figure, uh, bestriding his city of New York, and heroic in his posture and attitude, all controlling, all knowing. Ironically, he was ready for a big fall, not just because of the photography, but because he tangled once too often with the equally powerful and egotistical governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller. That's a story for another day. But Jane is portrayed as the polar opposite, down on the streets of her beloved Greenwich village, and an ordinary person who wouldn't really even look at twice if you passed her on the street, in dialogue with ordinary buildings and ordinary people. A stark contrast to the heroism of the New York skyline and of Moses's pose. You all know, I'm sure, that Moses grew up on Dwight Street in New Haven in a house that fittingly fell victim long ago to urban renewal. So there's that poetic justice as well. But I want to take one of their confrontations as, in a way, emblematic of what we'll talk about. Um, Bob Moses, as you know, or uh, I never met him, but I met a lot of his deputies and acolytes early in my career working in New York, and they all referred to him as Mr. Moses. And that is always a sign. People who work with Frank Lloyd Wright still refer to him as Mr. Wright. My students do not, by the way, call me Professor Plattus, but Alan, and you should too. Moses was a road builder, and not just that. To give him his due, he combined building roads and infrastructure with building parks and parkways and playgrounds and all kinds of really good things. He's starting in city government as a anti-machine, progressive politician, with the Parks Department. But from there, he took on more and more power and attitude and money and all the things that eventually contributed to this confrontation. However, one of his pet projects is not on this map, which, by the way, comes from Robert Caro's monumental biography of Moses, The Power Broker, published in 1974. So, roads, as I said, were the heart of Moses's modus operandi as a planner and as a builder. And the heart of his empire was this scene, the Triborough Bridge, for the construction of which he invented ingeniously an independent authority, the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, and presided over that for much of his career. That allowed him, as he preferred clearly, to operate pretty much out of the normal process of New York City politics because he was playing with money that came directly from the tolls on the bridges, roads, and tunnels he built. Neat scheme. As I said, one of his pet projects is absent from the map in Caro's book, and that is the Cross Manhattan Expressway, or as it came to be known, the Lower Manhattan Expressway, or Lomex. And you see the cover of the promotional brochure, which was issued in the late 50s. Moses had conceived of this project as early as 1935. It was formalized in 41 and obviously had to wait till after the war. Designed in the late 50s and then approved in the late 60s and finally canceled in 1971, which is where Jane comes in. A lot of money and energy was spent promoting this, which, as you see, connected the Manhattan and Williamsburg bridges with a limited access highway cutting through Lower Manhattan to the Holland Tunnel, running right through Soho, Chinatown, even the edge of Jane's own Greenwich Village. In 1967, the Ford Foundation hired the then dean of the Yale School of Architecture, Paul Rudolph, to produce this embellishment of the project, which, believe it or not, was intended to make it more palatable to opponents of the project. We could discuss that as well, but I need to go on. I use it here as a kind of straw man to contrast with all the things that Jacobs, by that time, an associate editor at Architectural Forum, writing columns and articles about urban development, a theme that would occupy her for the remainder of her career. But this was special, this was personal, in her backyard, so to speak. And all the things that she had come to recognize as contributing to livable cities and neighborhoods were obliterated by the expressway and even by Rudolph's visionary unbuilt project. And here is the first takeaway point. If you ask me to summarize Jacob's influence in my field of urban planning and urban design, or in our field of preservation, the first and obvious one is her astute presentation of how livable cities, safe cities, and neighborhoods work spatially. It involves, as we all know, sidewalks, streets and blocks, parks, diversity of architecture and people, but also what she tellingly calls in her book aged buildings. And all of that is summarized in this contrast. The second point is that she makes over and over again, but often implicitly, is that good city planning, and by the way, she called notoriously city planning in her day a pseudoscience, which angered all kinds of people, as you might imagine, including Robert Moses. And a part of the rhetoric that she was reacting against was the prevalent by then modernist idea that the right way to deal with aging cities and obsolete infrastructure was to, if you could, wipe the slate clean and start over. And that rhetoric, of course, came from the European avant-gardes of the 20s and 30s. I pick here on the French Swiss architect and planner Le Corbusier, who you can see the rhetoric that he's deploying. Il faut tuer la rue corridor. You must kill, obliterate the old-fashioned corridor street and let light and air into a new city, replacing wholesale the old. And that hand hovering over the model is not the hand of God, although that it looks like it and is meant to look like it. It's the hand of the architect, right? So the second point I want to leave you with is that in cities, and you might say now in almost everything, you don't want to start from scratch, but you start with the layers of human and material culture, but also with their embodying intelligence. And we would now add their embodied energy. You start with the city as it is, as a living artifact, a place where generations of people have lived and contributed. In other words, Jane is positioning herself not as an abstract and logical and rational and orderly philosopher theoretician of cities, but as what we would call an ethnographer. And obviously, here in Connecticut, but especially in New Haven, we are all too familiar with the results of the other style of planning. And you see a document probably familiar that was issued by the redevelopment agency in New Haven. And of course, they meant it to be not simply before and after, but bad, even evil, and good, modern, rational, efficient, smoothly operating, all of those things, even though in like the lower Manhattan Expressway would have if Jane and her friends had not stopped it, obliterating perfectly serviceable urban fabric and urban lives. So I would actually date the beginning of the preservation movement, not to the epic and certainly transformative event of the demolition of Penn Station in 1963. But in many cities, certainly in New Haven, to the massive demolition of whole neighborhoods by slum clearance and highway construction, like the Oak Street connector. The vision that it promulgated was one of urban functionality and efficiency. But again, Jane reminds us and called out then what was not obvious, that with respect to the cities and neighborhoods we value, efficiency, functionality, maximum speed is not necessarily a virtue. Some of you who are old enough will recognize the juxtaposition of these images as something I've inherited from my teacher, Vincent Scully, who, along with people like Betty Brown, Elizabeth Brown, was one of the founders of the modern preservation movement here in New Haven. And they joined forces to fight and eventually stop highway construction projects like Route 34. There was a spur, a plan connecting to I-91 through East Rock Park, and that they completely stopped, along with a lot of other neighborhood activists. And here again, the images speak volumes. What is going on is not only an argument, but a change of approach. You might say a change of style. And oh, by the way, everywhere I know, the key figures in this revolution, because that's what it was, were often women. And it's no accident, because along with godlike assumption of authority and power and expertise claimed by the architect planners, there was a certain kind of tight-lipped, Gary Cooper-esque macho aspect to all of this that is unmistakably represented in Ayn Rand's novel, The Fountainhead, and well portrayed by Gary Cooper in the movie version. And it dominated urban planning departments in New Haven and elsewhere. And you see Mayor Lee surrounded by his brain trust, happily pointing out like a schoolmaster the obvious need for a radical surgery on what was considered then a very sick city. And the guy with his hands in his well-tailored suit on the right of that image is none other than Yale urban planning professor Maurice Rodinbaum, who, as a young man in Europe, had been a disciple of Le Corbusier, obviously. So, change of style. But more than that, my third point, and the most important and really radical point about Jane Jacobs and her work is that it constituted an attack, a frontal attack on the so-called experts who had assumed authority and promulgated a top-down approach where they simply told people what was good for them and what was to be done for them and often to them. And this was not just a stylistic shift that we see in the early 60s and then throughout the subsequent decades. It's a shift in language or more broadly, discourse. I show you a photo from Europe of the meaning of the group that called themselves the Situationists, who, similar to Jane Jacobs in this country, launched an effective attack on the authority of so-called rational planning in the post-war years. And everywhere you begin to look now in the post-war years, mounting through the 50s into the 60s, this shift is occurring in the way that decisions get made and in the way that more and more people are, so to speak, invited to the table. Um, I was not surprised to learn that Jacobs, in her early career, was influenced by the man in the middle, community organizer and union organizer of enormous influence and controversy, Saul Alinsky. And from him, Jacobs obviously learned strategies of activism, including occasionally getting herself arrested, which she did, arguing against one of Moses's projects in the late 60s. And then after moving to Toronto, she escalated that activism and was arrested multiple times. This notion of the citizen activist or the activist and advocate planner working for underrepresented citizens is the start as well of the movement I am part of, the community design movement. And one of the patron figures is Brooklyn's own Ron Schiffman, who I show you as well. Well, obviously, one of the things that Jacobs did was to formalize and disseminate broadly all of that in a book project that was supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, that resulting in 1961 in the publication of The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And I own at least 3 copies of this book, a really dog-eared, much underlined and highlighted paperback copy from college. And then when I was a bit more prosperous, I went out and bought a first edition hardback. And the third copy, which I couldn't resist when it came out a few years ago, is a beautiful modern library edition as well. But Jacobs was not alone. She was part of a broadening movement, as I've argued already. And at exactly the same time, these 2 related books are published. One in England by the English architect and writer and editor at Architectural Review, which was sort of the British equivalent of Forum in those days. Gordon Cullen was his name. And you see a couple of typical pages from that book. One photographic contrasting, as we have already, traditional English town center with a massively reconstructed post-war town center. And you can guess which Cullen and most of us would prefer. In addition, Cullen illustrated his books and articles with these wonderful little sketches drawn from a pedestrian point of view, because an important part of the rhetoric of this, and I see Phil holding up his copy of the concise townscape, which is a summary of the original book and still in print. What you all will do when you do your Jane walk is assume that pedestrian point of view, not an airplane, not an aerial photograph, not a fast-moving car or train, but an embodied experience of the urban landscape. The other book from 61 is Kevin Lynch's image of the city. Kevin Lynch was an urban planning professor at MIT, and he sent his students out into cities like Boston and others to actually interview ordinary people and record their perceptions of urban form. And the approach is still hugely influential. And by the way, Lynch, as well, like Jacobs and Cullen, was in a real on the ground fight all around him, even as he documented spaces like Scully Square in downtown Boston. The Boston Redevelopment Authority was demolishing them for a huge mega projects like the government center. And I show you before and after photos from Lynch's book as well. Well, in 1958, these kinds of people, including both Kevin Lynch and Jane Jacobs, who are back to back here, and Lewis Mumford and others, were invited to a Rockefeller funded conference at the University of Pennsylvania on a new academic and professional discipline that they called urban design. So Jacobs was also present at the creation of what would lead in all kinds of directions, including to the new urbanism, to the Rousification of so many cities, and we can discuss those. But I end with a reminder of what is the fundamental difference of points of view. Because again, not only next week will you celebrate Jane's birthday in 1916 on May 4th. And by the way, she died on April 25th, 2006. And the next year, her adopted city of Toronto commemorated that date and honored her by launching the first Jane Walk on May 4th, 2007. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. It's a big coincidence that today is the day of her death. Especially since we never have these on Thursdays. So that was something that someone actually texted me during the presentation. So I'm glad you mentioned it. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask Alan? Don't be shy.
Are correct.
I think it's interesting that we're talking about a whole group of people that were reactionary to a sort of, as you say, a power move by people that assumed authority, which I find a very interesting concept because I went to something about AI, which I know very little about, but I was listening to the Connecticut Forum on AI, and we're basically putting the choices about AI in the hands of 6 billionaires, and we have no input on it. And it's kind of the same. It's an analogy to this movement where we ought to be learning more and speaking up more about what AI should be and what it shouldn't be, and where its flaws are. So I think it's a great moment to think about both of these architectural and uh, community development type ideas that affect all of us. So that's interesting.
Amen. I think that's the only thing to say, except that uh, I at least uh, think I understand something about cities and urban life. I'm not sure I understand AI
Yeah, me
yet.
neither.
My students do.
Right,
And I would trust them more than the billionaires.
right. Me too. Uh, so Hartford went through, I lived, in Hartford for the last 45 years or whatever, but it's gone through all the exact same things that New Haven and New York and all the dividing of the city by highways and destruction of neighborhoods and vibrant cultures throughout the city, and yet here we are. And
Yeah, ironically, what we're doing now in many places is taking those highways down
right,
uh, and trying to mitigate the effect that they had in dividing the cities.
yeah.
So, Alan, there was a question. Did Jane Jacobs confer with Kevin Lynch or Gordon Cullen or the Situationists?
Uh, I doubt she met any of the situationists, but who knows? Uh, but she certainly knew Kevin Lynch and a whole array of people. Let's remember, she was not really some anonymous grandmotherly figure. She was really out there. And although she never had a college degree, and a lot of powerful men mostly would refer to her as a housewife. And by the way, she was married to an architect, but she was far more famous and influential and connected. And I would not be surprised if she met Gordon Cullen. Of course, she knew Lewis Mumford. And in her editorial job, she interviewed all kinds of people, even before she took on Robert Moses. She had an assignment from Forum to uh, write about one of Ed Bacon's projects in Philadelphia. Bacon was the other towering figure of urban planning and not an easy person. a really smart person, and I did meet him at the end of his life, and that makes me 1 degree from Kevin Bacon, his son. But she wrote a pretty critical article about one of Bacon's projects. So she was on people's radar early on. And the person who got her to write the article that became Death and Life originally in Fortune magazine was the sociologist William White, Holly White, who himself would be a very influential figure in our field.
Now, moving on to the next question, what books would you recommend to learn more?
There's a book that recently came out about the early life of Jane Jacobs, especially in her native city of Scranton, Pennsylvania, an old industrial town like New Haven, very much like New Haven. And I'm forgetting the name of that, but I think Phil is gonna find it for me. Um,
Is
it's
it Becoming Jane Jacobs?
right.
Okay, I found it. I'll put
I'm
a link in the chat.
great. Thank you, Jordan. I would recommend that as well.
That's good.
Yeah, her first city before New York. And of course, there's a whole career after New York. Her husband and Jane moved to Toronto in, I think, 1968 out of opposition to the war in Vietnam. And there she became the same kind of gadfly activist, effective opponent of all kinds of ill-conceived projects. But all kinds of people, including many of us, I assume, have been influenced by her. And sometimes people acknowledge that influence, and sometimes they tend to suppress it or hide it. So if you're reading uh, Richard Florida or Glazer or James Kunstler or the new urbanist, any of those are really unthinkable without Jane Jacobs' work.
So one more question, maybe two more questions if we can fit them in. Has Jane Jacobs' philosophy completely displaced the top-down style of urban planning today, particularly in regard to street design with bike lanes, safe pedestrian crossings, etc.?
No, I'm sorry to say, it's been hugely impactful, but there are always self-appointed and even elective experts all around us who assume that they know better. And that's why I emphasize that part of her message, because these days people often do top-down planning in the name of Jane Jacobs, ironically, assuming that somehow if they follow her precepts, everything will be okay. But in my experience, people simply want to be at the table, whatever their opinion. And on the other hand, the mayor of Boston recently proposed reorganizing their planning agency and got a lot of pushback from people who were still gun shy about what the redevelopment authority did all those years ago. And we see that around here as well. What's the last question?
The last one is, how has the reputation of Jacobs changed?
Well, a lot of people say she didn't really write enough or acknowledge enough the impact of racial segregation in cities. And the other thing, she coined a word, unslumming, to allude to the revitalization of older neighborhoods. And we would tend to call what she was talking about back then gentrification. So some people have accused her of being, in effect, an advocate of what has come to be recognized as gentrification. As you know, preservationists in particular struggle with that issue all the time. And so do planners, because we've heard, for example, in working with disadvantaged, impacted, underrepresented communities, that they would, many of them, particularly homeowners, welcome a bit of gentrification. But we have this crisis of affordability. And of course, one of the least affordable neighborhoods anywhere is Jacob's own West Village.
Well, I just want to thank you. This has been great. I know everyone's ready to move on since it's after 1, but I just thank you. It's been a wonderful talk and great perspective.
Thank you. and have fun on the walks.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll let you know. We'll let you know how they go. Hopefully you can join us for one. But anyone, Jordan did put up the link for the talks, so or for the walks and for future talks. So please join us for those too coming up. Next week we're going to be talking about historic churches and their importance, and we'll be joined by modern ruins. So hope you can join us next time. But thank you, Alan, very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.